Welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Caleb Teskey, and today I am joined by Grant Smith-Ellis from Massachusetts. Grant, thank you for being here, and thank you for being patient while I got my stuff together here.
Oh yeah, great to be here with you, Caleb. And I'm on my winter break from law school myself, so no pressing matters on my calendar today.
All right. Well, before we get started, would you mind sharing your 5 minute life story with us?
Oh, I don't even think I need 5 minutes. But sure. Oh goodness, it's been so long since anyone has asked me to talk about myself. But let's see. Back in 2014. So 8 years or so ago, I was a graduate student at Boston College, where I'd also done some undergraduate work. And I was studying political philosophy and really thinking about going into academia when I became disabled due to a surgery that kind of went wrong. And as a byproduct of becoming disabled, I started to use medical cannabis. And that medical cannabis uh, really helped as I transitioned out of academia and into sort of a phase of my life where I was figuring out how to live with a body that, well, my brain may have been working, my physical body was not cooperating. So as a consequence of that, I started using medical cannabis from a Massachusetts caregiver. We have this great program down here in Massachusetts where, on a pro bono basis, not even for remuneration for their time, caregivers can grow medical cannabis for seriously vulnerable patients, up to 5 of them, and just give it to them, basically for just the cost that goes into growing the cannabis. And my caregiver was subject to some attacks by a corporate industry sort of front group. And as a byproduct of those attacks, my caregiver was arrested. That took away like the most important access pathway for me when it came to accessing my cannabis medicine. It really upset me, and it made me, as a patient, want to figure out how this had happened, who the people were involved. I had some sense that it was due to kind of the emerging regulated market in Massachusetts, that some of these larger players were targeting non-regulated or non-retail access pathways for patients to try to have them shut down. And that spiraled from 2016 into a 6-year career now at this point, keeping tabs, I suppose, on various corporate players in the Massachusetts market and in other states as well. And I've really taken a liking to sort of working within that oversight role of some of these corporate players wherever they pop up, whether it be impacting medical patient access, trying to target the unregulated market, trying to manipulate the regulatory process or otherwise. And we've had a lot of victories in Massachusetts over the past few years, a lot of which is due, I think, to a very active and engaged grassroots community down here. And I'm just grateful to play even a small part in that. So I wear a bunch of different hats these days. I'm here today in my personal capacity, but I chair MassCan, which is the group that hosts the annual Boston Freedom Rally. I'm a legal intern for the Parabola Center, which is a great federal policy, nonpartisan federal policy think tank run by Shalene Title, Lori Lucien, and Chanel Lindsay. And then I'm also a freelance journalist, and my work appears sometimes in Dig Boston, which is a local independent media outlet in the Massachusetts market. So that's an overview of what I do, I guess, from the 30,000-foot elevation perspective. And yes, there's lots to talk about. So I think that pretty much sums it up.
Cool. We could zoom in a little bit now. I wanted to ask you this because this was something you said on the phone about. You said a lot of the issues that you're seeing down there are this is kind of like an incestuous, I believe was the word you used. Um,
Oh God, did I really say that?
but I think that made sense. Like I usually go with circle jerk is the word I use, but it does seem like
Oh,
there's a lot of people
I
getting into.
prefer.
Sorry,
Oh,
go
I
ahead.
prefer. Oh, sorry. I prefer overlapping concentric social circles of influence, just to
Okay.
make sure the right term is used, because I think that's a little bit more precising. But yeah,
Yeah,
sorry,
that
Caleb.
actually I'm gonna start trying. Maybe that'll help me appear a little more professional. Uh, um, let's see. I know one thing that you talked a lot about was this delivery license, and I got a guy coming on tomorrow or maybe Saturday, who would like to know about that. So I was hoping maybe we could dig right into the delivery thing down there.
Yeah, sure. And was there another question first about like these overlapping concentric
Oh
social
yeah, like
circles of influence? Okay,
so
go ahead.
in what ways do you think that's affecting this, or like how much of this do you think is affected by those relationships?
Oh, well, I just gave a great talk a few weeks ago, and I'll have to share it with you at Aaron Schwartz Day. If you know who Aaron Schwartz was, he was one of the co-founders of Reddit. He helped create the Creative Commons license. He helped create RSS. Really, just a pioneer on the internet. Amazing human being, sadly gone, taken from us way too soon. But I gave a great talk at the Aaron Schwartz Day event, which can be found online, wherein I basically discussed how this very issue, these sort of structures of soft power, and in particular, the way they manifest in regards to what's called the Overton window, which is the range of acceptable uh, debate about a
Opinions?
topic or a
Yeah.
person or exactly in the public sphere, and in particular, how that framing of the Overton window facilitates either corruption of our government or can enable legitimate oversight by way of informed citizen participation. And a lot of this, I think, is found as a microcosm in the emerging cannabis industry for a number of reasons. One, we haven't had a lot of emerging market sectors in America outside of the dot-com bubble and things like that over the past 100 years. A lot of our industrial base sort of solidified itself in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then that solidified industrial base kind of spidered outward with its tentacles, so to speak. Octopuses is how they used to depict organs of industry in the newspapers in the early 1900s. Um, and so the industrial base could just capture, and what I mean by that is basically write the rules for new emerging industries in a way that was deferential to their existing consolidated market control. The cannabis industry presented this sort of unique, once in a lifetime opportunity to revisit an emerging market sector in America from an authentic perspective that was not just dominated by existing market forces. And while that has not proven to be the case in every state by any means, there are examples of policy victories in the cannabis arena which reflect this sort of newly emerging domain of authentic political oversight of what would otherwise be untouchable large corporations with nearly limitless resources. And for that reason, I think there's so much interesting stuff to talk about. Now we can talk, I know you want to transition into the way Massachusetts structured its delivery licenses, and I'll let you ask the question about that because I talked about this Overton window issue in the context of this loan fund that Massachusetts has. I'll set that aside for now. But the delivery license fight in Massachusetts is actually another really good example of how policy can either be used to sort of centralize market control for a few players or break things up and make things more fair. So yes, good transition.
Cool. Yeah, so we might as well like I feel like you said there was a lawsuit. People tried to stop the delivery equity licenses from going through. If you'd like to dig into those details, please get right in there.
Oh, sure. And if I sound like I'm trying to convey a lot, it is most certainly a few years of history being condensed
Good.
into a few minutes. So,
The more you talk, the less I have to.
uh, so the delivery discussion in Massachusetts really goes back to the spring of 2019, actually. At the time, now Massachusetts rolled out medical use cannabis in 2012, adult use in 2016. Now, when adult use was first rolled out, it was about a 2-year delay between when the voters passed the bill and when the licenses started coming out. And in those first round of license decisions, there was no delivery at all. It was just retail, cultivation, manufacturing, micro business. very limited license options. The commission decided, due to pushback from the appointing authorities at the time, mostly Governor Baker, who's leaving office now, but was very anti-cannabis before it was passed by the voters. He kind of encouraged the commission not to do delivery right away. So the commission kicked this decision down the road from 2017 to 2018. And then finally in 2019, they think about creating these delivery rules. But the problem was the initial proposal that they came out with was basically an Uber Eats model. And what I mean by that is that a delivery company could own a fleet of vehicles, have to pay insurance on them, own a place to store the vehicles, etc., pay drivers, but they would have to go pick up orders at retail price from brick and mortar stores and then deliver them to consumers, making money just on the delivery fee. Now, as you can imagine, who benefits the most from that structure?
Yeah.
Brick and mortar retailers who had clearly gotten the ear of the regulator who was in charge of the working group to design this delivery rules. And I mean, this is how politics works, right? The reality is it's just human beings, oftentimes one human being, creating a draft proposal, which then gets edited and discussed among a group. So they had gotten in this person's ear, clearly. And I don't think this person even realized that. I just think they thought, we need a more reserved model. And so the goals aligned of sort of the more not conservative, but moderate regulator who was designing the rules, whose name I won't use, and then these corporate interests who benefited from this Uber Eats model, even though it would screw over every independent delivery company.
Right.
So myself, and one other person at the time, huge kudos to her, Hillary King is her name. She also testified at the April 2019 public comment session, of which there is video, by the way, at the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. It was in Boston, actually. And both of us went to that public comment period and gave speeches basically saying, you can't do this. If you create this Uber Eats model, you've in essence facilitated market domination by these existing brick and mortar retailers, and it's tantamount to regulatory capture, which is when the regulations, as I mentioned, are written in a way that benefit the certain players in the market. And we said, you can't do this. This is a terrible idea. It will destroy the independence of these delivery companies, and it's just a ploy to make money for the existing brick and mortar retailers. Well, the regulators said, okay, we hear you, and we think you're right, but they weren't willing to give us what we wanted, which was a fully fledged standalone delivery model where you could buy product at wholesale, store it in a vault, and then do online orders and use vehicles to deliver from your vault to the consumer. That was the goal. They wouldn't give us that. But what they said was, what if we let micro businesses, I mentioned it earlier, it's this unique license type in Massachusetts. You can have up to 5,000 square feet of cultivation or manufacturing space. And in exchange for that capped square footage, plus in exchange for not being able to get any other licenses at all, you can get priority for licensing and things like that. And this micro business is a special license. The commission at the time, spring of 2019, said, listen, Grant and Hillary and others who want this, what if we let micro businesses get a delivery endorsement? So this micro business is already cultivating their own cannabis. They can manufacture it into edibles or other products. Why don't we just let them deliver directly? So it's kind of like a standalone delivery service. Not really, but it's kind of there. And we said, all right, well, that's not really what we want, but if that's all you're going to give us, I mean, that's a nice step in the right direction. So that's where we were summer 2019. 1 year later, a few other folks go to the commission. The Massachusetts Cannabis Association for Delivery, headed up by a gentleman named Aaron Goins. A few other wonderful folks are involved with it as well. And they, plus myself and a few others, say to the commission, listen, it's been a year. This Uber Eats model is not viable. There are only 3 micro businesses, so that is not viable for a pathway to licensure for delivery, right? You really need to give us this standalone delivery license. The commission said, okay, we'll do you one better. We'll give you the delivery operator license, as it's now called. So that means You can purchase product at wholesale, store it in a vault, deliver it directly to consumers after an online sale. We'll not only give you that, we'll give you a equity priority period where for 24 months at minimum, we will only give these delivery licenses, either the Uber Eats style courier or the delivery operator license, to companies that are 51% or more owned and controlled by either an economic empowerment or social equity applicant, which basically are applicants the commissions designates as either being from a community disproportionately harmed by the drug war, or being an applicant who themselves or a family member was disproportionately impacted by the drug war. So this is great. Advocates are saying we got the regulatory agencies doing what it's supposed to do. They listen to us. They're taking a stand in the right way. And what happens? The brick and mortar retailers, as soon as those regulations pass, file a lawsuit seeking to invalidate not only the delivery operator license, but the equity priority period as well. And so what did that show us who were paying attention? These brick and mortar retailers never really cared about partnering with equity companies or supporting independent delivery firms. They wanted to be able to get their own delivery licenses right away and have no competition and have no one else be able to be involved in the market. That lawsuit, due to a ferocious nationwide boycott that sprung up, lasted 7 days before it was withdrawn. The trade association who filed it, the Commonwealth Dispensary Association,
Yeah.
lost 14 of their members to the tune of $144,000 in yearly dues, and the lawsuit was withdrawn. That's an example, though, of what these companies will try to do if you are not only constantly involved in the regulatory process, but also constantly vigilant of their moves once that regulatory process plays out. Because if you are not, even one sort of week of not paying attention could have spiraled into the loss of the equity priority period and the delivery operator license.
Mm. And then especially after, when you change board members or, a little rule change here or there, if you don't stay on top of that, sometimes those little rule changes will definitely get you. And it's a lot, because people spent so much time like just getting the bills passed, just getting to legalization. And then we're finally over the finish line and everybody's happy. And it's it doesn't end there though, you gotta keep with it.
Oh, especially with these big companies. In America, money oftentimes in the minds of these large executives equates to being able to use laws and regulations as playthings or as means to facilitating further profit, which is why grassroots activism is such a threat to these large companies. And it's why they spend so much of their energy trying to either divide and conquer grassroots activists or trying to plant people within the community to distract. We have a lot of this that goes on in Massachusetts. I can't tell you the number of consultants who, during that regulatory revision with the delivery operator, were talking in public about how much they were supporting the grassroots and with the activists. And then in their public comments, behind closed doors to the CCC in writing, which were eventually published, by the way, you'd see them sending emails basically using the same language as like the CDA and these other retailers. So there's all of this stuff going on, but this is America. Every single industry in the United States is like this, but the difference is very rarely do grassroots activists with no money get wins. But we got to win there in that delivery context, and I think it's wonderful.
Mm. Have you got any other wins?
Well, the community as a whole, absolutely. It's in Massachusetts. It's not. There's so much more work to be done because even with the delivery victory and some of these other victories that the community has accomplished, which I'll talk about in a second here, it is so far from functional. The market, the percentages of companies owned by those individuals harmed by the drug war is still abysmally low. And one of the reasons for that is actually because of a lack of access to financing. And financing that is available in the sector is oftentimes facilitated by headhunters, oftentimes who will also masquerade as community advocates or organizers and stuff like that. But in reality, they're just headhunting for vulture capital firms that try to hook equity operators in particular or small businesses into predatory lending contracts, because again, banks can't do business with cannabis companies, so they're forced to rely on these predatory vulture capitalists. But what's interesting is in Massachusetts over the past year, 4 years actually, a bunch of advocates, Equitable Opportunities Now, Eon, former Commissioner Shalene Title, current Commissioner Nerys Camargo, current Commissioner Ava Concepcion, and others being just a few of the names who are working on this, went to lawmakers and basically said, listen, two big barriers here to small companies and equity companies getting into the market: municipal apathy and obstructionism, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the host community agreement process, as it's known, and lack of access to capital. But this is Massachusetts, right? So we have a super majority of Democrats in the House and Senate. And even though the governor was a Republican, Charlie Baker, a governor's power to veto is only relevant insofar as there's no 2/3 supermajority in each chamber to override that veto, which we also have, the Democrats in Massachusetts. So by we, I mean the state of Massachusetts. But anyway, going back to my point about the victory over the last year. So 3 or 4 years of activism related to barriers to market access for smaller companies culminates in a bill S3096. And this bill was an omnibus reform bill in Massachusetts, did a bunch of things, but one of the most important things it did was it created a 0% interest social equity loan grant fund, which is unlike anything that exists anywhere in the country in any market sector. And what it basically is there's a dedicated levy now of 15% on existing cannabis taxes in Massachusetts. And that 15% dedicated levy amounts to 40 to 50 million a year. That's going to go right into a fund overseen by a state agency, the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development, that will then give out 0% interest loans and some grants to SE and EE companies seeking to open cannabis businesses in Massachusetts. Cuts out the predatory lenders, cuts out the banks, direct from the tax revenue through the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development to the applicant. And we imagine there will be 40 to, we don't know the rules yet, but we imagine 40 to 50 loans per year, each about $1 million. Now, there might be some smaller loans if people need them, but that's, I think, what folks are hoping to see.
Now, why is that being done through the housing agency as opposed to like the control board?
No, it's the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development. So it's the
okay.
economic development aspect of the agency that deals with this loan program.
Okay, I got you. Boy, what would be can you talk about that host community agreement a little bit?
Oh, yeah. So in Massachusetts, getting a cannabis license is a bifurcated process. So you must get, before you can go up to the state level licensing queue and get your provisional or final license, you have to go through a local level approval process. And that local level approval process consists of 2 or 3 things: a host community agreement or an HCA, a special permit, and then it can sometimes also be like a city or town level license. Now, these host community agreements were a huge problem. They were being used basically to facilitate bribery in some cases. There's a very famous example. The gentleman's currently in federal prison, I think, the former mayor of Fall River, Jazel Correa. I actually live tweeted his entire federal trial for attempting to extort cannabis companies to get a letter required as part of the HCA process to open. Very, 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 very interesting situation. But as it relates to this HCA situation, what had basically happened was back in 2018, the Cannabis Control Commission had to make a decision as to whether or not they were going to review these host community agreements during the licensing process. So you got to do the host community agreement, get it signed, then you go up to the Cannabis Commission, who's supposed to approve your license and things like that. And the commission voted 4-1 against reviewing the host community agreements. And you might say, why would they do that? Well, it was only Commissioner Shalene Title at the time who voted in favor of reviewing them. And there's a great speech she gave, very prescient speech at the time, saying basically, if we don't review these agreements, we are opening the door to a flood of municipal corruption that is going to take years to untangle. She was very much right.
Yeah.
But the reason her colleagues voted against her was because they said the law as written didn't provide the statutory authority to the Cannabis Control Commission to review these HCAs for legality. Now, as a result of this new bill that created the loan fund, we also have reform to the HCA process, which mandates that the commission review those HCAs. And it also does one other thing that's very cool. It gives cities and towns a bonus from existing tax revenue for each social equity or economic empowerment store that opens in their borders. And then also, if those cities and towns that have cannabis shops do not open any SEs or EEs, it fines them in the amount of their total HCA revenue, which is 3% from each store in their borders from the past year. So it was a major, major piece of reform that passed that touched on a number of areas, and every single one of them took a hammer to corporate influence and basically was only helpful to smaller, locally owned companies.
All right. A couple of wins there. All right. They're tough to get, man. These guys got a lot of money
Yes,
and they push back hard.
they do. And I'll tell you one thing, I talked about it at the Aaron Schwartz Day event if people want to listen to that. But one thing the corporate operators tried to do in the context of this bill was, I mentioned the social equity loan fund was capitalized with a dedicated levy. And so folks outside of finance understand what that is. It's the government saying that they're going to put a certain amount of tax revenue from a certain source away into a special fund for a certain purpose. In this case, the 0% interest social equity loan fund. Now, initially, when the corporate forces that be got their hands on that bill, it was not a dedicated levy. It was a 1-to-1 match program where up to 25% of the tax revenue would go into the social equity loan fund if there were matching private donations first. So you can imagine
Yeah, right.
that this is what it looks like in the trenches to win a legislative battle, picking up on that change in language, going to the lawmakers involved and saying, you're not giving us a 1-to-1 match. We absolutely not. We will take a dedicated levy or nothing. And that's what resulted in the debate playing out in such a way where the lawmakers were choosing between a 10% dedicated levy or a 20% dedicated levy. They settled on 15. They weren't choosing between a dedicated levy or a match program. And that's because the advocates and the grassroots community was informed, engaged, and involved.
We had a medical fund set up here, and $700,000 magically disappeared from it and never got used. If it sits there long enough, I think it goes back to the general fund. It gets reabsorbed, and it just never got used. And it poof, there goes $700,000 that was supposed to be to help medical patients.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but it's also very interesting you say that because we put a clause, I didn't put it in there, someone put it in there, where none of the dedicated levy reverts back to the general fund from the social equity loan fund. But it's interesting that you say that in light of that provision, because I'm sure that is the kind of thing that happens all the time.
Right. Well, people don't read. Nobody reads it like that. Like, unless you're specifically looking for those exact kind of things, it's kind of hard. The average person is not looking for fraud and corruption. They're trying to start a business. They're looking for the rules that they have to follow. They're not looking. I'm looking for the rules that people are going to take advantage of. And that for sure, like, is a pisser, especially like if it just seems like an easy way out to not help medical patients, and that's the kind of shit that I'm looking for always.
Oh yeah, we have a lot of that in this state. People like to equate medical patient access with dispensary profits, and it's oftentimes the people like taking money from those dispensaries. So I was talking to you a little bit earlier about this sort of caregiver structure we have here, and it is so funny how much these kind of corporate interests loathe the idea of someone growing cannabis for a vulnerable medical patient and charging them just cost, not even for their time. There are people who I know who are quote unquote caregivers that flip out when they find out that the Massachusetts pro bono caregiver regs don't allow them to bill for their time. And I'm like, well, that's very telling about your motives,
Yeah,
because
right.
this is not it's not even a nonprofit structure. This is a pro bono structure. So if you want to be a nonprofit medical operator in Massachusetts, that's great. We're actually about to there might be like a breakup of medical licenses right now. Their medical adult use licenses are you can apply for a cultivation or manufacturing or retail or delivery. You don't have to have them all, but medical you have to do it all under one license. And they might break that up. It's called deverticalization. But there's this big controversy because all the existing medical firms are opposing a proposal to make those newly deverticalized licenses only available to equity operators for a certain period of time. So that fight's going to play out over the next
Yeah.
year. But also in the context of that medical deverticalization, there's room for people to run nonprofit medical cannabis operations, right? If they deverticalize, you can open a small cultivator, small retail shop, and have it be nonprofit. You can make money for your time, just don't exorbitantly overcharge patients. But don't come to a pro bono program and attack it because you can't bill for your time, because that tells me all I need to know about who you're really interested in helping. And it happens far too often in Massachusetts, and it really gets me going.
Yeah, and I've watched through the advisory committee meetings from last year in Vermont and the subcommittee meetings, and boy, they really shit all over home growers, man. And if they've said, "Oh well, what if we let patients grow at home? They're growing in their dirty basements, and it could get contamination." It's like, well, you guys are growing in a brick and mortar facility. You have a grow room set up, and I got at least 20 reports from people all over Vermont talking about selling moldy weed to medical patients for $400 an ounce. So it's like, you could shit on home grow if you want, but you guys aren't doing a good job. Why should we let you guys do it? Now instead of, they say, oh, we're ruining the medication for patients. It's like, now you're ruining the medication for a whole bunch of patients all at the same time. So how is that better?
Oh, and yeah, exactly. It's the epitome of corporate doublespeak. And I was just listening to reading an article where a bunch of corporate cannabis CEOs were lamenting the failure of the Safe Banking Act, and they were talking about how unregulated home grow and things like that are untested. I know for a fact that there are testing labs in Massachusetts and elsewhere that are knowingly passing contaminated product and knowingly inflating THC numbers to help these regulated operators obfuscate the threat to public health that exists in their facilities. One such operator in Massachusetts, Trulieve, killed one of their employees by failing, allegedly, according to Lorna McMurray's family, to provide adequate personal protective equipment on the job, and also allegedly for failing to adequately respond to an initial medical incident that occurred 3 months
Yeah,
before
there's two
Lorna's
months, 2 or 3
untimely
months.
death.
Yeah. And word up to Mike
And
Crawford. Shout out to Mike Crawford for doing a great job on that story.
yes, yes,
I got another
Mike
one of
is
their employees hitting me up right now who's probably going to come on the show. So that'll be interesting.
good. Yes,
And I talked to
Mike's a,
another woman. Sorry to cut you off, but I talked to another
no.
woman at a dispensary in Westfield who was just fired, who told me
Uh-huh.
very similar things: terrible ventilation, no masks, nothing like
You should
that.
name the company.
It was called Heka, Heka, Heka Dispensary in Westfield, Massachusetts. It looks
Well,
like
I mean, nice in the sense of nice that you name them. But no, I was going to
oh,
say, Mike Crawford does some good work. We used to work together. I think it's important that there's a worker focused voice in the space, because oftentimes unions and companies do a good job addressing major issues, but it can oftentimes be that it's the independent voice that addresses the issue that goes
yeah,
uncovered.
because that
Uh,
happened in January at Holyoke. That was in January, and when I interviewed Mike in September, I thought it had just happened, and he said no, that was at the beginning of the year. It's like, wow, so they tried to cover it up. It seems like it might not have got any airtime without that.
well,
That
it's
grassroots
so
effort.
yeah, and it's so fascinating because then you look back and like her obituary the month after or so mention it. Almost, tried, you could see the family was trying to get the word out. And I just can't even imagine what it would be like to be in the throes of corporate cannabis culture, to be confronted with that situation, and then feel like you're screaming into the void. And so, and I think this applies to so many situations. I want to touch on another worker protection story, which is the situation with Elevate dispensary in Athol. Have you seen this situation with the owner who was arrested in October? There's now been a public allegation of sexual assault against this
Oh, I
person.
did see that.
Yes, and so this, and I think whether it's the situation with the death of Lorna McMurray, the situation with Elevate in Athol and their CEO, whether it's the dispensary you just mentioned in Westfield, it's a pattern of employees seemingly screaming into the void and saying, that this is what's coming, this is what's happening now. And whether it be our regulators or even the police in some cases, there is always a delay, almost always a delay. And I'm worried at this point. I'm actually quite concerned that all of these harbingers and alarm bells being ignored is going to lead to a situation that is somehow even worse than what we've seen up until now. And that's what I'm very, very worried about.
And that's, oh yeah. And that was the same deal at in Westfield there. This woman was seeing a number of contamination issues. She was even worried. I remember her telling me about like working up the nerve to go talk to her boss. She's like, I don't really have a lot of experience and I don't want to like, shake the tree here, but like she was seeing mold and bugs and ventilation problems and plants that were too close to the lights and were getting burned. And she finally, eventually took it to her boss and she said, yeah, he kind of just like ignored me. He like told me to go back to work. So it's unfortunate because I've seen so many of these this is a medical dispensary and the pictures I saw of their cultivation facilities were atrocious and somebody is going to get sick from that.
Well, we're fundamentally running into the issue that we've created a society that values profit above almost anything else. And in fact, it's a legal mandate for companies to put their shareholders' interests first. They could be subject to liability if they were to do anything but. And the check and balance that used to be provided by our sense of what is right and wrong is totally out the window. Uh, it requires it requires that kind of active check and balance because if you think about it, the very origin of our oversight of companies came out of the early 1900s. But prior to that, there were children working in factories for 5 cents an hour, and worse. That oversight came about because people became engaged, because Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle and exposed the beef industry. And because Lincoln Steffens wrote Tweed Days in St. Louis and exposed that kind of political corruption, and because Ida Tarbell wrote The History of the Standard Oil Company and things like that, that's why we have the Department of Commerce. That's why we have the Securities Exchange Commission. That's why we have the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. But we haven't had a movement like that in 100 years. And that's why we're in the situation we're in, because we have those core values of respect for the person and human dignity and those who do labor and all of this. But our system of laws is so dominated by the industrial sort of corporate class that there's no wiggle room. And in fact, you can be confronted with serious violations of workplace safety standards. You can have evidence of it. You can bring it to regulators and still nothing will get done. And
You
that's
can actually
because that's where we are
there are
as a
actually
country.
laws. There are laws on the books, actually, food disparagement laws, where they, if you talk negatively about like a cattle farm, or some of these undercover journalists could be classified as domestic terrorists for trying to, disrupt the food supply, which I thought was part of the Patriot Act that they snuck in there. It's absolutely absurd. They tried to hit Oprah with it for talking about mad cow disease on her show, like back in the 90s, or maybe it was sorry, the mid 2000s there, after the Patriot Act. But boy, that's just ridiculous, you know? Yeah, these are the guys like, and she was right, actually. There was a like a outbreak of mad cow disease over in the UK at the time, but that was just them, I thought, trying to flex their muscles, saying, look, I mean, the case didn't go anywhere, but they said, look, like we can get Oprah in a courtroom, you know, so don't run your mouth, I guess, or something like that was sort of how I saw that situation.
Yeah, and one thing I will say is, although that can happen, it is a very good thing in the United States, that we have the level of reverence for the free press that we do. And I think that extends in particular into the context of criticism of corporate actors, which is held to the actual malice standard, which is nice, which means that to defame, and again, this is not legal advice, it's just me providing my recitation of what I think the case law to be, but to meet the standard for actual malice in the United States under New York Times v. Sullivan from 1972, you have to you you, you have to know or should have been aware of something being false,
Yeah,
basically. and
yeah,
and
it's
and it,
hard
it
to prove.
actually it does almost require actual knowledge of something being false, which is very, I mean, it's almost impossible to prove. And the reason for that is because of our, in my opinion, rightful reverence for the free press, which, circling back to what you were talking about, is the check and balance. It's not just the free press; it's the independent press. It's folks like yourself, and we have so many amazing journalists in Massachusetts, like Eric Casey has a great Substack. We have a great Cassie McGrath at the Boston Business Journal, Dan Adams at the Boston Globe, Shira Schoenberg with Commonwealth Magazine. I mean, we have heavy hitters when it comes to like the paragons of journalism in Massachusetts. And the work that those four alone do on a monthly basis has probably cost some of these companies hundreds of millions of dollars that they would have otherwise been able to make if no one had paid attention to what was going on. And I think that's crucial. I mean, that is the only thing keeping this republic from descending into whatever it would look like if we were openly run by corporations, because this is what
Yeah.
it's like when we're run by them in secret.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I saw Dan Adams. It sounded like he had an interesting encounter with the True Leave people. Maybe they threw him out of a dispensary when he was trying to cover the story.
Oh yeah, and that's Dan is tenacious. He huge kudos to Dan for his coverage of that and his coverage of the acreage tilt sea hunter deals. My goodness, that individual, being Dan Adams, nearly single-handedly stopped a giant corporate operator from putting up straw person owners and violating our license limits in Massachusetts. And
Hmm.
by virtue of that, Acreage declared their contracts in Massachusetts inoperable, and it cost them at least $500 million. So Acreage, make sure you send Dan Adams a cake every year, because we all think he's wonderful, and you should too.
And I see a lot of, I feel like I'm seeing that a lot in the social equity world. And there's now a lawsuit going on with Vicente Cedarberg, who is one of the big law firms and consulting firms who was pushing these social equity things, where they basically admitted in emails that, you know, they'll form a company to explore the possibility of acquiring a license. And that company will a lot of times have a black face on it, or a woman's face, or a social equity, economic empowerment face, something like that. And then after that company acquires the license, and they transfer to this other company, you know, he said, he's like, well, we don't always hire those people, you know, so they send people out to get their licenses for them under this guise, and then sort of push them out at the end. And boy, that just seems, you know, and that was for sure like one of the things I thought, like when I was looking at the regulations at the beginning, I was like, okay, so you could just get a woman to go out and grab a license for you, or you know, so and I'm seeing a lot of that. Do you have any comments on that situation?
I don't have any comments on that specific lawsuit, but in general, I will say that this is why I'm a very strong proponent, not of state license caps. I don't think there should ever be a cap on the number of cannabis licenses issued in a state, whether it's by license type or otherwise. Like, I don't like Connecticut's model, for example, at all.
No.
However, I think there should be a per entity license cap. For example, in Massachusetts, a single entity cannot own or control more than up to three retail licenses, up to 3 manufacturing, up to 3 cultivation, and up to 2 delivery. So have your 11 licenses. That's great. But if you try to own or control indirectly or directly a single license more than is allowed, I assure you somebody's going to find out about it and we're going to stop you. And I
Well,
think
this is
every state should adopt that.
Well, this is why this rule, if you own less than 10% of the company, you don't have to put your name on the license, which was another one I immediately saw. I was like, okay, so you could go around and just have 9.9. And the only reason this thing about the consulting firm came out, they're not actually being sued. What happened was one of the companies they helped uh, acquire a license is being sued because of a deal that they made. And because of that lawsuit, Vicente Cedarberg's involvement came out, and their ownership stake was revealed through that case. And I suspect that if we went around the country, we would see they have a lot of ownership stake, and now we have lawyers who are multimillionaires before some people have even got their businesses off the ground, which is I think is unfortunate. I'll call it.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah, I'll have to read more about that case.
I'll send it over after.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to ever comment about any active ongoing litigation, but always interested to read more. So
Cool. I have a note in my phone about Ponzi scheme regulator. And so Ponzi schemes is something that I've studied a lot. I think you said they're so good at financial markets, they can create instruments that nobody can understand. And I've certainly been reading about like derivatives trading and some of those transactions. Any thoughts? I'm not really a finance guy, but if you got any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them.
oh, goodness. Well, I mean, apropos of nothing, there's a great story I like to tell sometimes about so Teddy Roosevelt was not initially elected president. He was vice president for William McKinley, who was shot by an anarchist in Buffalo, and then Roosevelt became president kind of by accident almost. And in 1905 or so, Roosevelt got a bug in his ear about trust busting. And the famous kind of trust busting era was started by Roosevelt kind of getting this sort of momentum as a result of grassroots muckrakers and journalists. And a lot of them at McClure's magazine, by the way, just as an interesting historical anecdote, which folks should definitely look into. So Roosevelt in 1905 wants to have this meeting, and there were 2 kind of big conglomerates at the time. The first was J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which started as 2 refineries in Cleveland before he then went on to purchase all 26 of Cleveland's refineries and then basically every refinery in the United States. There was that situation going on. Well, there's actually 3 situations going on. So there was that situation going on. Then there was the situation with the railroads. The Southern Pacific basically like owned the state of California, for example. But like the railroad situation was way worse than that. If folks want to look into it, they can look up the Credit Mobilier scandal of the 1880s, and you'll find out all you want to know about how corrupt the railroad industry was and how mineral rights and congressional bribes and all of this led to just a very intense situation leading towards the turn of the 20th century. But my point with this is that in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt invites another gentleman who was involved with the third area of sort of big business at the time, which was market securities. The company was called Northern Securities, and it was run by a man by the name of James Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan. And so Roosevelt invites J.P. Morgan to the White House because he's going to file suit through the DOJ against Northern Securities to break it up, because it's a trust, it's a monopoly. And J.P. Morgan gets to the White House, and I don't think they had the meeting in the Roosevelt room, because I don't think that could have existed at the time. But I'm sure they had a meeting in one of the rooms, and Morgan gets very frustrated during the meeting because Roosevelt won't negotiate with him. Roosevelt is just saying to him, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how it's going to be. Now, Morgan leaves the meeting and Roosevelt leaves the meeting, and Roosevelt writes in his diary that that was his moment of clarity about these titans of industry, because Morgan came into that room and tried to treat Roosevelt like a fellow business owner. And that told Roosevelt all he needed to know about what JP Morgan and those folks thought about the government. And so my point with this, which was a little bit belabored, is that antitrust regulation came about because people in government realized that the only way to stop these businesses from basically spiraling out of control and dominating everything was to step in. These days, there's a little bit of aversion to government stepping in because those companies spent 100 years teaching us that government intervention is somehow a bad thing. And so I think there was more to that story, but that's where we'll end.
That was a good
What
one.
was
I
your
liked it.
question? Yeah, what was your question that you asked? Oh, it was about, that's what it was. It was about complex market instruments.
Mm-hmm.
So I think companies, in response to trust busting, they did more than just try to convince the American public that, every government intervention is communism. Like, I think they did more than that. I think they also realized that it was much easier to just pay more than the government could pay, like the SEC or some of these agencies, and use that talent to stay one step ahead. Now, I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. That's what precipitated the stock market crash of the 1920s, because of the way that unregulated margin lending basically created a pump and dump situation where these margin lenders, a margin loan is when you put down, say, 10% of $100 stock purchase, and you get 90% of it as a loan from a bank or something. And you then can invest in the stock market, which is great so long as the stock market's going up. But as soon as the stock market stops going up or crashes or whatever, you're left responsible for whatever you had borrowed on margin. Now, what this created in the 20s was a situation whereby these complex financial instruments all consolidated in the hands of a few people who could then do something called a margin call, in essence, popping a bubble. You can short sell. I'm talking about, if a market's going to crash, if you know it's going to crash, you can bet against it. Well, if you control the ability to make it crash and you can bet against it, that's a problem.
Which is what we saw in the 2008 with the housing market.
Well, that's where I was going. So what did the U.S. government do in 1933 in response to the Black Tuesday crash of 1928? They created the Glass-Steagall Act, which was a Great Depression era New Deal reform piece of legislation that mandated a separation between investment and deposit banks. If you were a deposit bank, you could not bet against your own deposit holders, because right, that just seems common sense. Well, it was common sense for 66 years, until 1999, when a bill called Graham-Leach-Bliley, and yes, that Lindsey Graham, otherwise known as the Economic Modernization Act of 1999, was passed. Do you know what it did? It repealed that mandated separation between investment and deposit banks, which then led to the rise of something called credit default swaps. And if you want to learn more about this, watch a movie called The Big Short, and you will find out all you need to know about complex financial instruments. But the point, to bring back to your initial question, is it is because of this Wall Street finance mentality that just stay a step of the head of the regulators, continue doing illegal things, and deal with the fallout once it happens, that we are in the larger situation we're in. But that is just another manifestation of this mentality among the American aristocracy, that simply making money entitles one to then write laws for their benefit. And it's wrong.
And I think that's a great point. And I think, especially, I don't want to say, the weed industry is a unique industry, but I thought it would have been a nice chance to just leave those guys out, but they're going to get their tentacles in everywhere. But, it's just, this is one industry that just is not, from what I've seen, growing up around people that consume and everything. It's more about the love of the plant as it is about making money. And and these guys are totally trying to distort that. And I
That's
and I
why I
don't
love.
like it.
Well, that yes, I agree with you. But that's why I love doing what I do for very little to no money. I find it incredibly enjoyable, invigorating, wonderful. Just knowing how the thought that some wealthy cannabis CEO is like downing $500 shots and taking lines of cocaine in anger that I like this ragtag group of grassroots activists beat them on a policy victory in like the legislative or regulatory context. That's wonderful. That is the best of America incarnate.
Yeah.
That is what this republic can be when functioning at its very, very best. But to do it, somebody said that the price, eternal vigilance is the price for democracy. Interestingly enough, one of the first interviews I ever did when getting involved with cannabis journalism was with Senator Patricia Jalen. She's a state senator in Massachusetts. She was on the compromise committee that edited the citizen passed ballot initiative to legalize adult use cannabis in Massachusetts. And I interviewed her that summer. And I said, the first question I ever asked was, Senator, I noticed that in the bill, originally there was only going to be one appointing authority for the CCC. It was just going to be the treasurer. But you all expanded it so that the governor would have an appointment, the treasurer would have an appointment, and the attorney general would have an appointment. Why did you make that switch to a tripartite appointment authority? She looked me dead in the eye and said back, well, eternal vigilance is the price of democracy. and her what she was saying to me was this will give constituents more of an opportunity to engage in direct oversight, which is going to be necessary to keep this arena authentic. And that is absolutely the key to the puzzle. If you want to protect and salvage this republic, informed citizen participation is the turnkey. All you need to do is apply that where needed, and you can do almost anything. The problem is, and this is a byproduct of years
Informed
and years
citizens.
of, well, that's one, yes, but the the bigger issue, and this is another passion issue of mine, so I apologize for diving into it, but
Get in there.
in the 1920s, Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, perhaps you've heard of him, founded a discipline called public relations. The first ever deployment of that discipline was something called Torches of Freedom. Are you familiar with it?
No.
Oh, you should Wikipedia it. It's great. Wikipedia Torches of Freedom to those listening, and you can look it up as well. Caleb, it's such a good example, as so many of the things we've talked about today have been, of what these corporations can do to our public discourse. Because this guy, Edward Bernays, gets hired by a cigarette company, and the cigarette company says, we have a problem.
Okay. Now that's
America,
ringing a bell. I was like, his name sounded kind
yeah,
of familiar. Okay.
exactly. American women don't smoke. In the early 1900s, it was considered unfashionable. Have you ever wondered why a lot of old pictures have women holding a long plastic tube with a cigarette in it? That wasn't a filter. Do you know why that was?
No.
It was so their fingers wouldn't touch the cigarettes.
Oh.
That was considered unfashionable.
Nah.
That's also why they used to wear gloves when they would be smoking. And in the 20s, this cigarette company hires Edward Bernays and says, listen, we got a problem here. Women won't smoke. This is a problem. Also in the 1920s, the women's liberation movement, the flappers, and the suffrage movement was becoming very popular. Well, what did Bernays do? He had 12 or 20 women walk in the 1926 Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade with cigarettes, calling them their torches of freedom. And within 2 years, 75% of American women were smoking. And
That
that is an
easy.
example. But that is an example of the appropriation of the language of justice by corporate actors to achieve what seems like a public policy victory for women, but is in actuality a corporate profit-driven scheme. And that's America in a nutshell.
Mm. Beautiful. Well, Grant, I think that's a nice place to wrap it up. I got to actually drive to Burlington. Thank you for being patient there. I'm not usually late, but I appreciate that. I wanted to give you a chance to at the end here. I really like to let the guest, if we miss anything, or if there's anything you'd like to throw in here, shout outs, shameless plugs, any events you got going on. Thanks again for joining me. I'd really like to do this again sometime if we can, but the last word's always for you, man. Take it away.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate you indulging my hyper caffeinated dive through history. I enjoyed that
That was great.
even during my winter break. Um, yeah, so in terms of myself, you can find more from me, Grant Smith-Ellis, on most social media platforms. I do also have a Patreon, patreon.com/ Grant Smith-Ellis. Sometimes I'll put out my work 45 minutes early on that Patreon. However, everything I do and everything I ever will do is always free to access. I'll never put a paywall on anything that I do. So your support just helps me to continue to provide that free content. So yes, thank you. I really enjoyed this interview. I think you're doing good work, Caleb, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again in the future.
Fantastic. Good luck with the rest of law school, my friend.
Yes, thank you very much. You can tell I'm a lot of fun in class, I can
Yeah.
imagine.
All right, Grant. Take care.
Talk soon.